The body in the water did not look real at first, a swollen, pale shape, half submerged in brown swamp, torn open along its side. For a moment, it could have been driftwood. Then, you see the scales and the tail. It is not a tail that belongs to the snake. A thick, armored alligator tail is pushing out through a ragged hole in the python's body, as if something inside tried to claw its way back into the world. The snake is split open from the inside. Both animals are dead. Whatever happened here, it was not a clean kill. It was a fight that both of them lost. People stared at that carcass and tried to fit it into the stories they already knew about the Everglades. Predator versus predator. One reckless snake, one unlucky alligator, a freak accident. They were wrong. This wasn't one animal that overreached. This was the smallest visible piece of a war that had already erased almost an entire layer of life from one of America's last wild frontiers. Today you will discover how a foreign snake spent 25 years quietly dismantling the mammals of the Everglades, while scientists, hunters, and regulators tried and failed to stop it. This is where the case becomes bigger than one dead python. So if you're interested in this story, subscribe, and let's continue. Before the invasion had a name, Dr. Michael Dorcas already knew what the Everglades at night were supposed to look like. He had driven those park roads in the 1990s, running nocturnal surveys with headlights sweeping the edges of the asphalt. Back then, the problem was not finding animals. It was counting them fast enough. Raccoons lined the ditches like thieves waiting for a chance at a dropped sandwich. Opossums waddled into the beams. Rabbits flashed and vanished. Foxes trotted across the lane and disappeared into the sawgrass. The tally sheet filled as fast as he could write. The road felt crowded. The swamp felt alive. That was the world he expected to see again when his team went back in the early 2000s to repeat the counts. Same method, same routes. Dorcas knew the pattern. He thought the new data would confirm it. Instead, the first thing he noticed was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The truck rolled forward, tires humming against the pavement. Headlights reached into the dark. Mile markers slid past. The radio stayed off so they could listen. Nothing moved. No eyes flashed and vanished. No silhouettes cut across the beams. At one point, Dorcas looked down at the clipboard and realized he wasn't marking animals anymore. He was marking distance, kilometer after kilometer, with blank space where numbers used to be. He didn't need statistics to feel that something had broken. You could hear it in the absence. One bad drive could be a strange night. So they kept going. Dorcas and his co-authors later compiled the full data set, 56,971 kilometers of nighttime road surveys between 2003 and 2011, compared directly to counts from the 1990s. It was like holding two photographs of the same place taken 10 years apart and realizing half the subjects were missing. Raccoon observations had collapsed by 99.3%. Opossums by 98.9%. Bobcats had dropped by 87.5%. Marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes weren't recorded at all. For Dorcas, those weren't abstract percentages. They were the absence he had driven through, now written down in a scientific language that didn't soften the blow. The Everglades he remembered from his early surveys was gone from his own data set, but the paper did not name a killer. Not yet. Even with invasive Burmese pythons already documented in the park, the team had to be careful. Habitat change, water management, natural predator cycles, disease. All of these could play a role in shifting mammal numbers. You can't put one species on trial just because it arrived before things fell apart. Someone else would have to answer a harder question. When a mammal disappears here, what actually kills it? That question ended up in the hands of another scientist, working not from the road, but from the grass. Dr. Robert McCleery and his team didn't start with theory. They started with traps. Day after day, they set live traps for marsh rabbits, waited, checked, reset. For 6 months, they worked in the Florida heat and bugs, pulling wild rabbits from cages one by one. Each animal kicked and struggled the way rabbits do when a hand reaches in. Each one was fitted with a small radio collar, just enough weight to carry an ID and a signal. 95 rabbits in total, 95 tiny transmitters. McCleery's plan was simple and brutal in its clarity. Release these rabbits into 2 different worlds. In one, the python-infested Everglades. In the other, a similar wildlife refuge 100 kilometers away, where the invasive snakes were absent. Then follow the signals until they stop. If habitat change or drought were to blame, both sites might see similar patterns. If pythons were the real killers, the Everglades collars would tell a different story. On release days, the experiment looked almost hopeful. You see McCleery's team kneeling in the grass, lifting trapdoors, watching rabbits burst out and vanish into cover, small antennae flicking for a second in the air before the plants swallow them. Data points with heartbeat and fur. For a while, the radios chirped steadily from both sites. Dots moved on maps. Rabbits lived their short, ordinary lives. Then, slowly, the beeps from the Everglades side began to die. Each time a signal went silent, a field worker picked up a receiver and started walking. Through waist-high grass, along levees, into hummocks. The closer they got, the faster the beeps rose, until they stopped altogether at some patch of ordinary-looking ground. More than once, when they parted the grass, they found the same thing. A thick, motionless Burmese python, swollen from a recent meal. In the control site without pythons, most dead rabbits turned up in the stomachs of native predators like coyotes and bobcats. The pattern there looked like a normal food web. In the Everglades, the pattern had a different shape. By the time McCleery's team finished the experiment, 77% of documented rabbit deaths in the python-invaded site were caused by Burmese pythons. The collar signals had done what Dorcas's empty roads could not. They caught the killer in the act, over and over, until the list of alternative explanations shrank to background noise. For people who had wanted to believe that the collapse in mammals might be temporary or driven by some diffuse environmental stress, the rabbit experiment was a breaking point. The data didn't shout. It just left very little room to hide. If pythons could quietly claim 3 out of 4 tracked rabbits in an area already stripped of small mammals, what had they been doing, unseen, to every other species that fit in their coils? To find out, other teams turned to the bodies. Across more than a decade, researchers at USGS and partnering institutions dissected 1,716 wild Burmese pythons captured in Florida. They opened stomachs and intestines and recorded everything they found that could still be identified. The prey list grew into a grim catalog. At least 76 species in total. Mammals, birds, reptiles, raccoons and opossums were there, the same animals that had almost vanished from Dorcas's road counts. So were wading birds that depended on the wetlands' shallow waters. Deer turned up inside snakes that should have been outmatched by their size. Pieces of alligator were recorded as part of the python diet, a quieter echo of that exploded carcass from the opening scene. Mammals alone made up roughly 3/4 of the documented prey items. The picture was clear. These invaders weren't picky. They were eating across the mammal community and far beyond. New research added a disturbing twist. Burmese pythons can consume prey up to around 6 times their own body mass. The physics of the swallow mean less than you'd hope. In the right conditions, a snake that size can take down an animal that looks, to human eyes, far too big to fit anywhere. Put Dorcas's vanished mammals, McCleery's radio-silent rabbits, and the diet inventory together, and the Everglades starts to look like a crime scene where most of the evidence has already been digested. By this point, the state of Florida was not waiting for more papers. Wildlife officials and local organizations had been organizing removal efforts for years. Trained hunters working under contract, public python challenge, events where people were paid per snake, dedicated programs like the Conservancy of Southwest Florida's removal team. Since 2000, more than 23,000 Burmese pythons have been taken out of Florida. The Conservancy alone has removed around 20 tons of snake since 2013. Photos from collection days show piles of lifeless bodies, dozens of snakes stacked together like discarded ropes. Each one is a victory in the moment. Each one is also a reminder that there are more. Because while people dragged carcasses to trucks, the data on the ground refused to cooperate with the fantasy of a winnable war. The mammal numbers didn't bounce back to their former levels. New pythons kept turning up in new parts of the landscape. Egg clutches with dozens of shells appeared in places people hadn't expected them yet. Every year that passed made it harder to pretend this was a temporary spike. Regulation, too, had timing that hurt to look at in hindsight. The federal move to ban the import of Burmese pythons as injurious wildlife came in 2012. Decades after the first confirmed wild snake in 1979, and long after the species had established a self-sustaining population in the wild. For scientists watching the numbers, it felt like closing a gate on a pasture that was already full of cattle. By the time all these threads converged, Dorcas's empty roads, McCleery's rabbits, the 76 species diet list, the 23,000 removed snakes, the scientific question had shifted again. It was no longer, are pythons causing this? It became, is there any realistic way to push them back? USGS researchers and other experts who had spent their careers in the Everglades found themselves giving interviews that sounded more like autopsies than battle plans. They explained that Burmese pythons in Florida have no significant natural predators at the scale that matters. They explained that the snakes are individually cryptic, extremely hard to detect unless they move or happen to be in the open. They pointed out that most python removals happen when an animal is crossing a levee or a road already exposed. The ones that stay still in the grass or water are effectively invisible. The conclusion that emerged in reports and on camera was brutally simple. The population is now considered fully established, and total eradication is impossible. In one scene, you can imagine a USGS scientist standing at the edge of a familiar swamp, the same kind of road where Dorcas once counted raccoons. Behind them, the landscape looks unchanged. Water, grass, a fading sky. Someone asks, can you still get rid of them? There's a pause long enough to feel the weight of the question. Then, no, we can't. That's not defeatism. It's a recognition of scale. You cannot trap or shoot your way to victory against a predator that hides better than you can search, breeds faster than you can remove, and has already filled a niche you can't empty without tearing the ecosystem apart even further. For Dorcas, the cost was seeing a place he knew transformed into something quieter and emptier than his first surveys had prepared him for. For McCleery, it was watching rabbit after rabbit turn from a living animal into a silent signal inside a snake until the pattern left no room for comfort. They did what scientists are supposed to do. They counted. They tested. They showed the mechanism. But knowing how a collapse works does not reverse it. Tonight, if you drive the same Everglades road Dorcas used for his counts, your headlights will still cut through the dark. You may see an occasional shape in the ditch. You may even catch a raccoon or a possum. It will not look like the crowded, messy world of his 1990s notebooks. Somewhere out there, beyond where your lights can reach, the real dominant hunters lie coiled and unseen. The offspring of snakes that no one thought worth worrying about when they were still exotic pets in living rooms and roadside shops. The swamp looks untouched from a distance. The difference lives in what is missing when the engine idles and the night stays quiet. The map did not lose its rivers or its grass. It lost the animals that used to move between them. The case is still debated. One side says human delay and the exotic pet trade turned an avoidable invasion into a permanent wound. The other says that once Burmese pythons touched a place like the Everglades, a collapse of its mammals was only a matter of time. Which side are you on? Let me know in the comments.